As regards price caps, we need to distinguish between oil price cap and gas price cap. On oil price cap, as you know, there is a work ongoing in a framework of G7, and we'll be having also discussions on this on the sides of the IMF meetings. And I would say we are getting there as regards this G7 oil price cap. And in the EU, we had already all the necessary adjustments done in the 8th package of sanctions. So we're ready to implement when the exact price cap is decided at G7 level. Then there are indeed discussions ongoing on the gas price cap in the EU. No decision is taken on this yet, because there one thing which we need to do, we need to distinguish between Russia, and the Russia supplies are sharply down, and other partners. So we cannot just unilaterally now impose price cap on other partners like Norway, like United States, who are actually stepping up the effort to provide us with more natural gas for us to make up for a shortage of Russia's supply. So this needs to be a negotiating solution, because on one hand it's true that our partners really stepped up and helped us in a difficult moment. On the other hand, of course, the prices are extremely high, and they are higher in Europe than elsewhere in the world, and we do not see justification for those prices being so much higher in EU than in other parts in the world.
You still haven't really, though, nailed down the timing on this. I understand the differences that you're explaining, but how close do you think we might be, given that you have a more intimate understanding of how the negotiations are going than I do?
That's the point. As I said, no decision is taken yet, so the discussion is ongoing. I cannot give you exact timing. On oil price cap, we seem to be getting there, and that could be already in a relatively short time. On gas price cap in the EU, something where the discussions are still ongoing.
Well, one of the keys to the reshaping of this in Europe, it seems to me, is where you benchmark to. And I know that's one of the ongoing conversations about how you come up with an alternative price benchmark that is perhaps more reflective of the pure cost of gas at this stage. Do you have any clarity at this point what you might decide to use as a reference point for that gas benchmark?
Indeed, it's clear that the current benchmark is not reflecting the current supply reality, and the fact that we are to much larger extent now depending on, for example, LNG gas supplies. So we are working on this new benchmark, something Commission already has announced, along with other, so to say, emergency interventions in energy market. But this is still work in progress, so I cannot comment in detail on exact design of the new benchmark. But it's clear that we will be changing the gas benchmark.
Europe has suffered a very large terms of trade shock, in part because of the energy price spikes, but there are all sorts of issues here as well. This is not a time when we want to see further unfair competition. Can I ask you, in that context, do you think the American efforts now to deal with its own inflation crisis, the Inflation Act here, whether that is going to add further distortions to the international trading picture? How does Europe react to it?
Indeed, as regards U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, we welcome the aims and purposes of Inflation Reduction Act, including the greening of U.S. economy. As you know, in EU, we're also very active in this direction. But indeed, we do have concerns on a number of provisions in Inflation Reduction Act which are discriminatory against EU companies. We are already in touch with U.S. authorities. Also in these days, I'm having meetings with U.S. counterparts, with Secretary Yellen, Secretary Raimondo, Ambassador Tai, where we'll be raising those issues. So to give, for example, concrete example on electrical vehicle tax credits. We do this also in the EU, but we are not discriminating. So the consumer can get a subsidy for buying electrical car, even if it's, for example, Tesla made in USA. In US, the way it's designed, it's discriminatory, it's US assembly requirements, it's also for batteries US content requirements, so correspondingly European produced cars cannot get those tax credits. And it's not only about electrical cars, it's also about other parts also in batteries, in hydrogen and other elements, so that's in a sense what we are contesting. And to give you another example, last month, a Tesla Model Y was the most sold car in Germany. It would not have happened if we were applying also discriminatory support. So that's where we see the issue. We welcome, obviously, the greening movement towards electromobility and so on and so forth, but we insist that it should be done in a way which is not discriminating EU companies.
Give us a bit more color on this, because we know from the past that the dispute over Boeing and Airbus eventually spilled into tit-for-tat trade levies. Is there any risk that, given your seriousness about this issue, that we could end up in a similar place with the United States over the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, it must be said that we had built up a very good relationship with Biden administration. We managed, as you know, to park the very same Airbus-Boeing dispute. We had found some solution on steel and aluminum tariffs, are now working on towards this global steel and aluminum arrangement, so to say, to solve this dispute for good. So we hope that we'll be able to engage constructively with our U.S. counterparts and find a solution also to these concerns so that it doesn't become a major trade dispute.
The semiconductor issue has become now another smoking trade dispute between China and the United States, perhaps more about security of supply and about the IP lead that the United States doesn't want China to have in this technology. But it does look as though Europe will suffer collateral damage, potentially. How do you protect European companies in this space, like ASML or Siltronic, from this?
It's something where we are still doing the more in-depth assessment. Once again, going to be one of the topics I'm going to discuss with Secretary Raimondo in these days. But currently we are doing in-depth assessment because, in a sense, one of the number of concerns U.S. has vis-a-vis China we share. So we need to see, in a sense, what is the best approach. We also are cooperating on export controls in a framework of TTC, and in line with agreements we have in the TTC framework, we were given also advanced warning on those export controls. So, but this still requires more in-depth assessment. We need also the feedback from EU member states, from industry itself, to see whether there are some undesired side effects and how to best address them with our US counterparts.
Both of these stories, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act or whether it's the semiconductor dispute that we're seeing at the moment, it seems to me they just illustrate perhaps how slow Europe has been in varying its sources of supply and perhaps making itself more insulated against these kind of international trade disputes. I mean, we increasingly have a situation with China, it seems, where Europe is incredibly reliant on all sorts of chips and part-finished product that end up in the European supply chain, that if China decided tomorrow not to supply them, Europe would grind to a halt in some industries. How do we resolve this?
That's true, and we're already working for several years on diversification and of our supply chains and making them more robust. And in this context, in a sense, there's also a bit of new thinking and new momentum concerning our free trade agreements with different partners around the world, among other things, to diversify our supplies and access to raw materials and critical minerals and other inputs in supply chains. So this is something where we're working very seriously, and where we're also coordinating this work and discussing our approaches with the US.
Let me just wrap up by asking you about China. There are a number of smoldering areas of disagreement, obviously, and the way that the Chinese regime has positioned itself doesn't always make it easy to talk to, but there is a potential for reset here. Xi Jinping will speak on Sunday. This is a major party congress event. What are your hopes for reset with China? Can it happen? Can you have an improving relationship in many areas with this country?
It's of course important that we continue to engage with China, because China is the world's second biggest economy. We are having a very complex relationship with China, as you know. It's a cooperation partner in some areas, economic competitor in some others, and systemic rival in yet some others. So we need to navigate this complexity, but without, so to say, decoupling or disengaging. So also this year we had our EU-China summit. We had high-level economic dialogue with China. So this engagement is ongoing, but we know relations are complicated. There are sanctions and counter-sanctions on human rights issues, for example. There are other elements. There are clearly issues related to the level playing field in our economic relations. So all those issues we need to discuss, and of course we need to see what kind of new momentum there is going to be after the Congress.